In 1715, the most powerful kingdom in Europe was quietly going bankrupt. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the architect of Versailles, the man who had dominated European politics for half a century, died that year, leaving behind something no one wanted to inherit, not just a throne, a debt so large that annual interest payments consumed more than the entire royal tax revenue. The treasury wasn't struggling, it was empty. Grain prices were high, unemployment was rising, trade had slowed. The government was borrowing money simply to pay the interest on money it had already borrowed, and the financial tools available to France in 1715 were essentially medieval. Tax collection, coin debasement, and the dwindling goodwill of creditors running out of patience. France needed a solution. Not a modest one, a fundamental one. And into that vacuum walked a Scottish gambler, with a theory that would reshape the French economy and then bring it to its knees within 5 years. This is Forgotten Economy, where money, power, and history quietly intersect. John Law is one of those figures history tends to misplace. He is remembered, when remembered at all, as the architect of a disaster. But that framing obscures something important. Before the disaster, there was a genuine mind. One of the most original economic thinkers of the early 18th century. Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith and banker. He was mathematically gifted, intellectually restless, and by his early 20s had developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous card players in London. Not dangerous because he cheated. Dangerous because he understood probability better than almost anyone alive. In 1694, that life unraveled. Law killed a man in a duel, was convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and escaped from prison. The exact method still debated by historians. He spent the next 2 decades moving across Europe: Amsterdam, Venice, Genoa, Turin. Everywhere he went, he observed how money moved, how trade worked, how economies expanded and contracted. And everywhere he went, he carried the same idea. An idea he had been refining for years. An idea that most governments considered too radical to touch. Gold, Law argued, was the wrong foundation for a modern economy. He wasn't dismissing gold's value. He was making a more precise observation, that tying the money supply to a scarce, physically limited metal meant permanently constraining economic activity. That trade required liquidity. That liquidity required money. And that the amount of money in circulation shouldn't be dictated by how much gold happened to sit in a country's vaults. He proposed replacing it, or at least supplementing it, with paper notes backed by land, and later by the productive capacity of trade itself. Most countries dismissed him. France, in 1715, was desperate enough to listen. Before tracing what happened, it's worth understanding why Law's idea was compelling. Because it's easy, in retrospect, to treat him as obviously wrong. He wasn't. His core observation was this: economies with more money circulating grew faster. When liquidity was abundant, merchants could trade, craftsmen could invest, governments could build. When money was scarce, locked in vaults, or concentrated among the wealthy, economic activity slowed regardless of how much real productive capacity existed. He had watched this in Amsterdam. The Dutch had built the most dynamic economy in Europe, not because they had more gold than anyone else, but because they had better financial instruments. Bills of exchange, early banking notes, sophisticated credit mechanisms that allowed money to move further and faster than physical coin alone could manage. His argument was that paper currency, properly managed, could do the same. That the real foundation of money wasn't gold sitting in a vault, it was confidence. Confidence in the institution issuing the notes. Confidence in the economy behind them. Confidence that the paper could always be exchanged for something real. He was right, in the long run. Every currency on Earth today operates on exactly this principle. The question that 1720 would answer in the most consequential way possible, was whether confidence could be built faster than the institutions needed to sustain it. The regent of France, Philippe d'Orléans, gave Law permission to try. In 1716, Law established the Banque Générale, a private bank, initially modest in scale, with the authority to issue paper notes redeemable in gold. The notes began to circulate. Merchants accepted them. Tax collectors accepted them. The French economy, starved of liquidity for years, responded almost immediately. Trade volumes increased. The velocity of money accelerated. Businesses that had been paralyzed by credit scarcity began to function again. For the first time in a decade, France felt like it was moving. Law's notes carried one significant advantage over coin. They were guaranteed to maintain their value in gold terms, meaning they wouldn't be quietly debased the way the Royal Mint had repeatedly debased actual coins. Merchants trusted them. Some preferred them. The regent noticed. In 1718, the bank was nationalized, renamed the Banque Royale, and given expanded authority. Tax revenues were now payable, in Law's paper. The experiment had moved from private initiative to national policy. Up to this point, the system still had limits. Those limits were about to disappear. Law's ambitions didn't stop at banking. In 1717, he acquired control of the Compagnie d'Occident, better known as the Mississippi Company, a trading enterprise with exclusive rights to develop France's Louisiana Territory in North America. The territory was vast, largely unexplored, and almost entirely unknown to the French public. Law changed that through what we would today recognize as a deliberate marketing effort. Louisiana was described in terms that bore little resemblance to reality: rich soil, abundant resources, a new world of commercial possibility waiting to be unlocked. Pamphlets circulated, accounts spread. The shares Law issued to fund the enterprise became objects of intense public interest. Over the following 2 years, he systematically consolidated control. The Mississippi Company absorbed other French trading monopolies: the East Indies Company, the China Company, the Africa Company, until it held authority over virtually all French overseas trade. It then absorbed the Royal Mint and the right to collect French taxes. Law had constructed something without precedent: a single enterprise that controlled the money supply, the national debt, and the entirety of France's external trade simultaneously. And the shares were still rising. By 1719, the streets around Law's offices in Paris had become something between a marketplace and a spectacle. People who had never owned a financial instrument in their lives were buying Mississippi shares. Aristocrats, servants, merchants, clergy. Shares were issued in tranches, each one priced higher than the last, and each one oversubscribed before it closed. Fortunes were being made in weeks, in some cases, days. The word millionaire entered the French language during this period, coined to describe the people emerging from these months with wealth that simply hadn't existed before. Law's paper notes were funding all of it. To support rising share prices, the Banque Royale expanded the money supply. More notes were issued. More liquidity entered the economy. Prices rose. Not just share prices, but the price of ordinary goods, land, and property. Inflation, in the modern sense, was arriving in France for the first time at scale. The system had developed its own momentum. Rising share prices encouraged more investment. More investment required more notes. More notes pushed prices higher. Each element was reinforcing the others. From the outside, it looked like prosperity. From the inside, the structure was beginning to show its weight. The first signs were quiet. In late 1719, a number of the largest shareholders, aristocrats, and insiders who understood the mechanics better than most began converting shares back into paper notes, and paper notes back into gold coin. Quietly, without announcement. Law noticed and moved to close the gaps. He restricted the amount of gold any individual could legally hold. He made paper notes mandatory for large transactions. He attempted to legislate the exits shut. But the exits couldn't be fully closed, and questions moved faster than legislation. The question circulating through Paris in early 1720 was straightforward. If Mississippi shares were worth this much, and if the paper notes behind them were backed by gold, how much gold was actually in the vault? When people began calculating seriously, the answer was uncomfortable. The Banque Royale had issued notes far beyond its gold reserves. The Mississippi Company's share price implied a valuation of Louisiana that bore no relationship to what the territory could realistically produce. The entire structure rested on confidence, and confidence was beginning to fracture. In May 1720, a prominent French prince publicly converted 10 million livres in paper notes into gold coin and had it transported out of France by wagon convoy. The signal was unmistakable. The broader rush to convert began. The bank could not honor all redemptions at once. It attempted to suspend gold payments. It tried to enforce paper circulation by decree. Neither worked. You cannot legislate confidence back into existence once it has left. By the end of 1720, the system had ceased to function. Share prices had fallen more than 90% from their peak. Paper notes traded at a fraction of their face value. The middle class of Paris, many of whom had converted real property and real savings into shares and paper during the boom, had been largely erased. John Law, who had arrived in France as a celebrated theorist, fled the country in December 1720. He died in Venice 9 years later, neither wealthy nor famous, playing cards again. The Banque Royale was dissolved. The Mississippi Company was wound down. France returned to metal coinage and attempted, as best it could, to move past what had happened. The damage was not easily contained. Trust in paper money, in banking institutions, in financial innovation of any kind, had been broken for a generation. The French financial system hardened. The reforms that might have modernized it were politically impossible now. The word banque became so associated with ruin that the French language developed a separate word, case, to describe institutions people might actually trust. Here is where the story becomes quietly significant. At almost exactly the same time, Britain was experiencing its own version of the same event. The South Sea Bubble of 1720. Same mechanics, same mania, same collapse. But Britain's response was different. The British government restructured the debt, introduced early financial regulation, and continued developing the banking and capital market infrastructure that had begun with the Bank of England in 1694. Within a generation, London had become the financial center of the world. British merchants could access credit. British governments could borrow at low rates. The Industrial Revolution, when it arrived in the mid-18th century, was built on that financial foundation. France, shaped by Law's experiment, avoided paper money and modern banking for nearly a century. When the French Revolution arrived in 1789, the government's financial options were constrained in ways that directly contributed to the crisis. The inability to manage sovereign debt, the very problem Law had been brought in to solve, helped bring down the monarchy. Two countries, the same year, the same event, completely different responses, and a divergence in economic development that shaped the following 2 centuries. Most financial histories don't dwell on this. They should. The Mississippi Bubble is 300 years old. It still contains almost everything. The gap between narrative value and real value. Shares priced on the story of Louisiana, not the reality of it. The self-reinforcing loop of monetary expansion and asset inflation. The speed at which a liquidity crisis becomes a solvency crisis once confidence breaks. The impossibility of rebuilding trust through legislation once it has gone. These aren't historical footnotes. They are the recurring mechanics of every significant financial crisis since 1720. The specific assets change. The instruments change. The geography changes. The underlying structure does not. What Law identified correctly was the principle: money is a technology of confidence, not a store of metal. The world eventually arrived at that same conclusion. Every central bank on earth operates on it today. What he ran ahead of was the institutional architecture required to make confidence durable. The regulations, the transparency, the limits on issuance, the separation of monetary policy from speculative interest. the things that allow a paper currency to hold trust over decades rather than months. He had the right idea and the wrong timeline, and France paid for that distance for 100 years. John Law wasn't a fraudster. That distinction matters. He wasn't selling something he knew to be worthless. He believed in the system he built, believed in it completely enough to stay in France long after the intelligent exit, attempting to hold it together through legislation and will, watching it come apart regardless. The Mississippi Bubble is not a story about deception. It's a story about what happens when a correct idea arrives before the structures exist to support it. When confidence is asked to carry more weight than institutions can bear. When the distance between what a system promises and what it can deliver quietly widens, until the day it doesn't close anymore. France rebuilt. The ideas Law introduced, paper currency, central banking, public debt management, became the foundation of every modern economy. In a meaningful sense, he was right about the future. He simply couldn't build it fast enough to survive the present. That gap between the right idea and the right moment is one of the quietest forces in financial history. It appeared in 1720. It appeared in 1929. It appears every time a system expands faster than the trust beneath it can grow. The Mississippi Bubble was the first time the modern world saw what happens when confidence outruns structure. It wasn't the last.